going to switch over to
Hi, this is Jeng-Chyang. Welcome to
another
the channel Rajabhat.
Stuart, you hear me?
Research Corporation.
Do you have Roger's number to ask him just to try one more time? And or yeah, both of you guys just got kicked off. I'm going to go over to I'm going to just stay on Zoom and we'll just do it on live on Zoom. But do you have a phone number to reach him or?
In Clemson, South Carolina, at the beautiful. It's a beautiful and relaxing.
Let me.
day.
I'm going to quit this. All right, everybody. So join us over on the YouTube channel. We'll make this a two-part episode. I don't know what's. But join us in just a bit on the YouTube channel.
Get my displays up and running. Hi.
Got a couple over here. I'm just right here.
Yeah, it's rainy out there.
I know.
You be careful out there. You be safe.
Thank you. I'll be trying.
So we should be back, and hopefully there'll be some guests remaining on the channel listening in to part 2 of this special interrupted interview with Sir Roger Penrose and Dr. Stuart Hameroff. And I don't see it live. There it is. Now we're live. There's one person watching. Good. That's at least more than could be expected. So let me continue. So we were discussing the yeah, we were having fun.
That's the way it is.
I was saying,
working abroad.
Yeah, so we were talking about yes, the role of the collapse of the wave function. I mentioned I would like to know if, let's say that there isn't the Copenhagen interpretation is not correct, and there is sort of an Everettian world, many worlds phenomenon. Could such a thing be? Could microtubules play a role in it? In other words, do you need a collapse? If you don't have OR, can you have a theory of quantum mechanics that doesn't feature state reduction in the same way as it does in the standard Copenhagen interpretation? Do you get consciousness, or does consciousness not arise in some sense?
Well, the view is that OR by definition is which means orchestrated, and OR, well, it spells OR, but it means objective reduction. So that theory simply doesn't occur. I mean, it's just, it needs the collapse of the wave function. And I've never understood how you can have many worlds. I mean, it doesn't really explain conscious experience or anything like that. Because if all the alternatives, the quantum alternatives coexist, why are we only aware of one of them?
Right.
And theory doesn't have anything to say about that at all. It just doesn't make, to me, I hate to say this because there's so many philosophers in Oxford who are strong supporters of many worlds, so I should shut up. My view is very different from that. You've got to have things where there's just one world that survives and the other ones die off in a sense. But the alternatives, yes. For OR, you have to have that.
So, is it more an objection to the many worlds theory in that it doesn't seem to accommodate consciousness, or is it sort of more evidentiary for the standard or Copenhagen type wave collapse, etc. In other words, if God tells you there are many worlds, how would you react? I mean, would you say no, that can't be because there's no consciousness in such a state?
Well, it doesn't live comfortably with consciousness because it doesn't explain why conscious experience only experiences one of these worlds. And even worse than that, and this was the thing I always objected to. It's all right, you could imagine that for some reason it's one world, but why do we, all of us, see my friends come drifting off into other worlds? Why do they seem to be companions with consciousness just like myself?
I've had time to do
that. Seem to be inhabiting the same world that I have. So it doesn't make any sense to me. So why philosophers take it so seriously, I find is very strange. But I think, you see, they're too wedded to the equations that we know. You see, the equation, the Schrodinger equation, Schrodinger was absolutely clear in pointing this out. His own equation does not explain the world we see. The world we see has to have some other ingredient, which is, in some sense or other, the wave function collapses. So you get one alternative and not all these possible alternatives coexisting. I mean, they do if they're small enough. So that's the puzzle. You have to have a theory in which, okay, yeah, when you're talking about small things and you're talking about, particles or atoms or molecules, as long as they're small enough, they seem to follow the Schrödinger equation. So you need to have a theory which tells you when they get big enough, they don't follow the Schrödinger equation. And the idea is here that there's a scheme which tells you how long these superpositions can exist. And if they're very tiny, it's more or less longer than the age of the universe. But if they're sizable, it might be microsecond. So you've got to sort of balance this right so that it comes about, so that these collapses happen with structures that are about the right size. And that's the question. To make the theory work, you've got to make sure that these numbers come out right. Mm-hmm. And the numbers are how long the collapse takes come from a pretty clear equation. It was due to Linus Yoshi, actually. He had the idea before I did, but he didn't have the motivation that I did. And his version is different from mine. But it's certainly the same idea. This depends on gravity. So you have to have a theory which involves the ideas of Einstein's general theory of relativity, which is the theory of gravity, and curved space-time and all that. And you try to fit that together with quantum mechanics. And many people regard it as one of the profound problems of physics is to what they call quantized gravity. So they're thinking of imposing the rules of quantum mechanics on gravitational theory. But to me, that's going the wrong way, because it doesn't deal with the problems that are inherent in quantum mechanics, namely this problem of superposition of states not persisting. We don't see that in the world we observe. So you need a theory which is put right. And the claim is that Einstein's general theory of relativity, when appropriately combined with quantum mechanics, will do that for you, which is the other way. It's gravitizing quantum mechanics rather than quantizing gravity.
So is it true that you wouldn't have consciousness in Minkowski space? I mean, would it be impossible without gravitational force? I mean, obviously you'd have matter, you'd have a brain, you'd have some gravitating. But is it impossible then to have consciousness in a region that's either perfectly flat, has no matter, or is otherwise free from perturbations?
Well, yeah, it would be the claim. Yes. Certainly the Orko theory claims you've got to involve gravity. So if you had things that didn't involve gravity, and if space-time is flat, it's got to involve Einstein's theory, not just gravity in the Newtonian sense. And you've got to have that. So I would agree, yes.
Mm-hmm.
If your systems are too small or something to affect the gravitational field significantly,
and thank you very much to our sponsors.
And when you guys started this conversation 30 years ago, did you ever think there'd be experimental tests, both some of your, besides what you do, where you put people to sleep, which I point out, I do that every time I give a lecture, students. I do the same as you, Stuart. So don't feel too, I'm not a real doctor, okay? But did you ever think outside of the brain, the medical world, that we do physics experiments on consciousness, or is this totally, a surprise to you?
No, I was hoping for it, certainly, and I'm not a physicist, but I studied a lot of physics in undergrad and followed it along. And what we've found is that because of the aromatic ring for high resonance, where the quantum stuff is happening, that quantum optical effects occur. And what we've been hearing about here at this conference are reports from two different laboratories, one at Princeton with Greg Scholes and Ara Kara, where they did tryptophan fluorescence lifetimes in microtubules and tubulin, and found that if you zap a microtubule with a UV photon, there's a signal that propagates 50 nanometers or so along the microtubule. That's a quantum process. And if you then add anesthesia, it goes away, or you dampen it. And we did it with two different anesthetics, one a gas, although we did it in the liquid phase, and then the other, a soluble liquid anesthetic, etomidate. The gas was isoflurane. And that's being written up now, and it should be a very nice paper. Arak Kalra was the postdoc who did a superb job. And the other is in a lab at University of Central Florida, and the lab of Aristide Dogariou, who is a quantum optics guy who got into biology, and he's been looking at a slightly different quantum optical effect in microtubules called delayed luminescence, where you hit the microtubule with a photon, but much lower energy photon, a visible photon. And what you see there is that the microtubule actually has what's called delayed luminescence, gives off photons for up to a second or longer, which is a very long time in quantum effects. And also in his experiments, anesthesia took away this delayed luminescence, which we think may be a phenomenon called superradiance, that there's a subradiant state and it leads to superradiance, which is the prolonged state. And that seems to go away with anesthesia. What we want to do next is to do those studies in the gas phase so that we can have the microtubule in a chamber, in a plexiglass chamber, let's say, with air, and then we introduce with the gas inlet a little anesthesia and see if the delayed luminescence superradiance goes away. And then when you blow away the gas anesthesia and go back to air, then it comes back like a patient going to sleep and waking up. That's what we want to see. And then we will do it for different anesthetics, which have different known potencies in putting people and animals to sleep. And if the potency in dampening the superradiance matches the potency in putting humans and animals to sleep, I think we have a darn good argument that that's the molecular correlate of consciousness. And I have to say, Brian, that these experiments are, preliminary, but they're very promising. They go in the right direction, and I think they're far more than any other theory of consciousness has, really, because we're not quite at the mechanism. We're not at Rogers objective reduction, but we think these quantum lead to the objective reduction, and how that happens is a whole other story. The controversy, because that's related.
Yeah, well, I want to get to that in a second. But one thing came to me as a terrifying thought. I heard I got a genetic test recently. It's just part of a checkup, and it came back that I'm 99.7% genetic garbage. But besides that, I say nobody's perfect. Nobody's perfect. But it also said that that I respond to anesthesia. In other words, that I don't have inhibitors, or I don't reuptake them, or I forget exactly. You'll be able to correct me in about 2 seconds. But there are people, the doctor told me, that will have anesthesia applied, and they'll be fully conscious. And in other words, there are people you can't turn off genetically. They have a predisposition. Can you explain what that is? And then could these types of people be sort of a control? In other words, obviously conscious, not responding to anesthesia as a typical, normal member of the society would, or population. Can you explain what's going on here?
Well, I'm not aware of people being totally immune to anesthesia. There are genetic conditions where people are resistant and need more, but anesthesia always wins, at least in my experience. If we give enough drug. One of the genetic traits that is resistant to anesthesia is require more, and so we have redheaded patient, we give them a little bit more, no big deal. Another category of patients are people who are taking the anti-cancer drug, which stabilizes microtubules, and they require more anesthesia. So those are two examples of people being resistant to anesthesia, but I'm not aware of anybody being totally resistant.
I got it. Good. So, Roger, we heard recently some results from an experiment that was supported partially by the Foundational Questions Initiative. This took place in Gran Sasso, which is normally I think of as a particle physics laboratory deep underneath the Dolomites, I believe it is, in Italy, not far from Rome. And there are many experiments done there, xenon experiments, dark matter detection experiments. First of all, can you explain the experiment? Why was it put there? And what does it have to do with either bolstering or criticizing Orko?
Well, I should explain that the idea was to test an effect which people believe, at least these people, believe should arise from a state reduction theory like mine. Now, the thing is, it depends on a formula which tells you how long a superposition between two states will last, which is actually due not to me, but to Lajos Joshi. And he had this idea before I did. I independently came across the same formula using ideas based on general relativity, where I don't know quite where he got the ideas from first. So this was something in common between his theory of state reduction and mine. And when I say state reduction, I mean the collapse of the wave function. Now, the thing is that in his version, you would expect a certain effect of the substance will be heated but spontaneously. So if you have a material which is isolated as best you can from the rest of the world, it would slightly heat up spontaneously by itself, just a little tiny bit. And the argument for that is that all the time you have superpositions in the body, and these superpositions become one or the other all the time. And when they become one or the other, it sort of jumps. And this means this jumping is taking place all the time, and that to try and test whether bodies would. And they found that they didn't. Now, to me, not the expectation I have, because although my model had the time scale as the oceans did, it's not the same theory. And it's subtly rather different. And I suppose that's one of the reasons people didn't take it into consideration. That I can put it in a rather strange way. See, suppose the system is in a superposition. It becomes in a superposition of here and there. So it's originally in one place, then it becomes in a superposition of two places. But after a certain point, it becomes one or the other. Now, if it does that, the state sort of jumps to one or the other. But that's not my view. The view that I have is that when it reduces to one or the other, it's as though it's being, suppose it reduces to this one rather than that one, then that means state was in effect being this one all the time. And this is a strange theory because it sort of looks as though the world behaves retroactively. That is to say, you thought it was in a superposition, and then it becomes as though it had been one or the other all the time. And you have to try and understand how that kind of retroactive behavior can make sense and doesn't allow you to send signals into the past, which would be disaster if you could do that. Disaster for physical theory. But it's the reason that people didn't think of that idea. And I didn't think of it first. But I had been thinking of it for a few years. I think 2 or 3 years I've been taking that view seriously. I think I was at one of Stuart's conferences on consciousness, and it occurred to me that's the way you had to look at it. It's a little bit more subtle because to make it make sense, you have to take the view that there are two slightly different kinds of reality. One of them is what I call classical reality, and the other is what I call quantum reality. And quantum reality, these superpositions kind of persist as two things at once. And the classical reality, it's got to be one or the other. And it goes back to that classical state of being one or the other. But it does it as though it had been that all the time. So it's kind of retroactive in that sense. The decision of which to do comes later, but then it becomes as though it had been that one all the time. You have to make that kind of crazy-looking theory make sense. And the reason it's it is because it's a crazy-looking theory. And you have to realize why this, although crazy-looking, does actually make sense and doesn't give you communication with the past and things like that. It doesn't give you sort of scientific nonsense. It really hangs together as a whole. But I did different points of view, not even really fully together until a paper which I wrote, which should be coming out sometime this month, I gather. It's in a volume of different articles by
I'm listening to the
Chinese person called Shan Gao. It's published by the Oxford University Press. And Stuart has an article in it, and I have a separate article in it. In this article, I do explain this point of view and how you can have these two kinds of reality and why it makes sense.
And
those
Stuart, there's some
papers
questions that
are
we're taking from the audience.
very
And by the way, you can
interesting.
always ask questions for all my guests. I have Nick Bostrom coming
They're
up, Roger's
broken
colleague
down
over there in Oxford.
in the
He's coming on
process.
Monday. I have Bernardo
In the
Kastrup coming
conclusion.
on. I've had
Abstract.
Sabina Hassenfelder's episode is coming out. She did an interview with Sir Roger for her new book, which is wonderful. Existential Physics comes out on Tuesday. So stay tuned. Also, you can ask questions on my YouTube channel or on my Twitter account. So there's some questions that have come in, and I want to start taking some of them because I know you guys, it's getting late for Roger at least. Stuart, people are asking about psychedelics, which are, maybe the opposite of anesthesia in a certain sense. Maybe they heighten awareness in certain ways. Is there a role for these if you could arrange the permissions to do it? And I know there are people at Johns Hopkins. Tim Ferriss is famously leading a big study or funding a big study for Stanford, I believe. Is there a role of psychedelics?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, we were discussing, and we hope to do those experiments. They are tricky. The prediction is, or my prediction is, that they would have the opposite effect. And if you look at the molecules, LSD, psilocybin, DMT, they're aromatic rings, just like the tryptophan, very similar to tryptophan inside the tubulin. And so they have these electron pi resonance orbitals that are fluorescent, luminescent, delayed luminescence, super radiance, all that kind of stuff. And so the prediction would be that if you, and the other one prediction is that they will bind directly to microtubules. Now, most researchers will say, well, they bind to the 5-HT2A receptor on the membrane surface, which they do, but they're small, non-polar, and they get inside and should bind to microtubules directly and would increase the quantum optical effects that we saw dampened by anesthesia. They would go in the opposite direction. So that's a very important, and we hope to show that. Could I address the experiments that Roger was referring to?
Yeah.
So Diashi was one of the investigators, and they were looking for radiation. His theory of OR, whereas Roger's theory of OR does not predict radiation. And so they did this experiment, and over 2 months, and to make a long story short, they found no radiation. So what they could have done, I think, is say, well, okay, Diashi OR is wrong, or Penrose OR is correct, but they didn't want to accept that. And what they did was they said one of the parameters must be wrong. So the parameter that they looked at it has to do with the nature of superposition. How can something be in two places at once? What does that mean? And of course, Roger explained it by taking the equivalent curvature in space-time geometry and saying you have opposing curvatures. And when we did our first paper, Roger and I, in 96, he said the first thing we have to do is calculate, the superposition of how can a protein be separated from itself? And he gave me the homework assignment of look at it as the whole protein partially separated from itself. Look at it at the level of each atomic nucleus in that protein separated